All right, intertextual consistencies. By intertextual, we mean we're going to talk about some things in the Bible. So we're kind of getting off the topic of canonization now and looking at the New Testament. And we're going to look at some of the connections of these apostles, the way that their lives interconnected, the way the text interconnects. And this shows us that the text we have it's authentically from who they say they are. It was from a network of these apostles and early church leaders who were connected, who had connected lives. So we're really going to look detailed into the lives of these men and through the biblical text. And then we're actually going to step outside the Bible and look from other secular work after that. So they interact through their text and show their relationship with one another, and their testimonies connect, and it brings validation, and it shows us the history of the text. So guys like Paul, John, Luke, and Peter, and this is probably not what they look like. These are just pictures from the internet. It's just, but it's a nice slide. It looks nice. But introducing the guys we're going to talk about, and we could go deeper than this, but we're just kind of gonna kind of keep it a little more superficial, because obviously there's more guys that wrote the New Testament. But we've got connections from Paul to Jesus, John to Jesus, Paul and Luke, and Paul and Peter. So we're going to talk basically about this. Paul's epistles were from the 50s to 60s AD. And Paul references Jesus' teachings multiple times. For example, we talked about last class in 1 Timothy, a direct quote from the book of Luke is in Paul's epistle. Word for word quote of the book of Luke. So he quotes Jesus there, but also in Romans you get paraphrased quotes of Jesus' teaching. Especially you see a couple times him talking about loving your neighbor as yourself, fulfilling the whole law. That appears in Romans, right? That's quoting Jesus. So he was working from some kind of gospel text, most likely Luke or an early form of Luke, because that's who he worked with, especially if he's quoting Luke word for word. We also learned last class that Luke scribed some of the epistles for Paul, because the textual critics can go into those. I think it was 1st and 2nd Timothy and one other epistle were scribed by Luke, because it has Luke's vocabulary and sentence structure in those epistles. So Luke worked with Paul to write those letters, and he literally hand wrote it for him. So we've got Luke more connected to Paul than we even thought. And so no wonder he quotes Luke word for word, because it was Luke quoting Luke word for word is what it was, which is pretty cool. And you've got other times of this happening. John references the same passage about loving your neighbor as yourself in 1 John 4. So we've got multiple quotes of Jesus coming into these epistles. And so that shows that the Gospels were present, active, and circulating around the church here in the middle of the first century, right there in the 50s and 60s AD. And that shows us also the Gospels probably weren't written later in the 70s, 80s, 90s, like some secular sources may say. They were really very present there in the probably 50s. They were already there. So there's connections between Paul and Luke, like some we discussed, but also in Acts you've got Luke talking about Paul's missionary trips. That's a big part of the book of Acts. And it makes sense that he wrote so much about Paul because he worked with Paul. But also in Paul's epistles, you've got a lot of things mirroring back on Acts. So in Paul's epistles, you've got Priscilla and Aquila referenced twice, in Romans and I think 1 Corinthians. And their story is recorded in Acts. So you've got Paul writing to the churches about Priscilla and Aquila, and you've got Acts recording Priscilla and Aquila, and it's Paul and Luke. And so you see the men's relationship here. You've got Paul's conversion in the book of Acts, recorded. He gives the actual record, then a later testimony of it. And then you've got Paul talking about his conversion in some of his epistles also. Paul also mentions Luke directly in Colossians, 2 Timothy, and Philippians. And they have a material that agrees with what Luke records about their missions trips. The events in going to Damascus are recorded in both places also. Then you've got John and Jesus. In John's gospel, you have Jesus renaming Simon to Cephas, right? So Peter. So Cephas meaning rock. Paul actually records Peter's name as Cephas in 1 Corinthians and Galatians. So, but he also records it as Simon. So you have Paul using both names for Peter. So it again shows that Paul was intimately connected to Peter. And Paul even says he spent some time with Peter. So you have the connections between those men also.
In the book of Galatians, they were together, and Paul calls Peter out for how he was acting
that's
with
right.
the Jews when some of the bigwigs weren't there. He was all buddy-buddy with them, and then when the bigwigs came around, he was like keeping himself separate from the Gentiles. And
right.
Paul's like, bro, you can't do this. Like, that's not right.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, another time he's with Peter there. Yep. So, good. Yeah, so more connections between these guys. Peter acknowledges Paul's writing as scripture in 2 Peter 3:16. So, the script, what was recognized as inspired text, was right there in the biblical text. Peter is acknowledging Paul as inspired work. So the inspired work was right there in the early first century. It was acknowledged as inspired work, and we see through the Muratorian fragment and then these later councils that these inspired works were carried through the church, and they weren't something that was made up and guessed later in the 300s. They were things that were carried through time and well established in the early church, well established even during the apostles' lifetime. And there's many other these sorts of consistencies that bring validation, truth, authenticity, and recognition to these inspired texts.